Hello, everyone. Welcome to the questions and answers about the legal aspects of volunteers and gleaning session. I am excited to have two wonderful speakers here to share some important knowledge on this topic with you all. I'm going to give you all a few updates first, and then we'll introduce the session and our speakers. I did want to quickly clarify the chat and question features for this session. We want this to be a very interactive session. We welcome questions throughout the presentation. We're going to try to take time to pause throughout the presentation to take those questions. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a little person and what looks like a blackboard behind them. If you click that, Sean has kindly put in a test question for us. You will be able to type in a question at any time during the presentation in that tab. And if you go to that tab and you see a question that's very similar to your question, or a question that you'd also like the answer to, you'll see there's a little heart icon under each question. So you can click that heart icon, and that actually elevates the question in the list. So when we do pause to take questions, or at the end, we'll go down the list and try to hit those questions that have the most interest associated with them. So I did want to draw your attention there. If there's other comments you want to make, or you want to share resources with other participants based on questions they ask, feel free to use that chat tab. That is a public conversation, so if you feel like you want to go into a breakout room with an individual or message an individual to have a more extensive conversation, you are, of course, welcome to do that. But feel free to use this chat tab to just have a side conversation during the presentation, share resources, etc. So I did want to point that out. We'll be monitoring that questions tab pretty closely to get you the answers that you need. Okay, so to get us started on this topic, I am excited to introduce Claire Child and Rachel Armstrong. Claire is the Assistant Director and a Research Fellow at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, CAFS, at Vermont. And Rachel Armstrong is the Executive Director at Farm Commons. So I'm going to turn it over to Claire first to get us started.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's really kind. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for coming, everybody. Like Stephanie said, I work for the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. So I have a master's of environmental law and policy. I'm not a lawyer, so I want to say that up front. I don't take legal advice from me, but I am going to introduce the National Gleaning Project, and then Rachel is going to introduce herself and talk through some of the questions that we have kind of collected from you and the gleaning community over the past couple of months, and talk about the answers that we are beginning to put together, and she's beginning to put together to those questions. And then we'll definitely have some time for discussion or for your questions. And if you have additional questions about volunteers and gleaning, or about other topics around the legal aspects of gleaning, I would love to hear those. We may be able to answer some of them. I imagine there will be some that we can't answer, and we will keep those and do some research and see if we can get those answers to you in a different way in the future. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. I forgot to do that. Great. So the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems trains law and policy students to develop real-world solutions for a more sustainable and just food system. So we do our work by, we're part of the law school, so we do our work by involving students in our projects, teaching classes, and producing, like I said, legal and policy resources to benefit the farm and food system community. So this project, the National Gleaning Project, was begun several years ago, and we're currently in the middle of a collaboration with the Association of Gleaning Organizations to update the database of gleaners and make some changes to the interface to make it a little bit more user-friendly and approachable. The National Gleaning Project is essentially a repository of legal and policy resources relevant to gleaning at the federal and state level. It holds a map of gleaning organizations and some reports and fact sheets that are researched and written primarily by CAF staff over the years. It's currently divided into these 3 buckets, but again, we are looking to update this interface, so you may see some changes over the next 6 months, I would say. And we're excited for that. We have a lot of ideas, and we're going to see how much progress we can make over that time. It's also intended to support networking and connection among gleaners, and we're currently collecting additional resources from your membership, from AGO's membership, to share with all of you and with new and beginning organizations. So things like liability waivers, safety protocols, and operations handbooks. So if you have a resource that you'd like to share that you think is especially useful, and no one has asked you for it yet, please feel free to email that to me. My address is at the end of the slideshow, and we would really appreciate having those to share back with the whole community. So as part of this update, we're also looking to develop new resources and fact sheets on topics that are relevant to gleaners, especially where there might be gaps or things that you are wondering about or asking about. So we've been talking to people from different gleaning organizations, trying to get in touch and hear about concerns. And the first topic we decided to tackle is volunteers and how to involve them in your work without accidentally violating the Fair Labor Standards Act. So Rachel now I'm gonna turn it over to her to talk about the questions that we've identified and the research that we've found about those answers. And then, as I said, we'll come back to hear some questions.
All right. Thanks, Claire. Sounds great. And thanks to everybody for joining today. I'm Rachel. I'm the founder and executive director of Farm Commons. I am joining you from northern Minnesota today, where, gosh, it is above freezing, and that to me is a good day in northern Minnesota. So we haven't crossed the average frost-free date yet, but one time, soon. This is a picture of my family back in the day. Got off the boat from Norway, headed out here, I guess because it's cold, and started farming. They bought land originally stewarded by the Fond du Lac tribe of Ojibwe Indians here in northern Minnesota, and took over stewardship of that land. Is still in my family today. So that's really where I come from. Farming has always been in my blood. It's always been my passion. It's been everything that I have done. But somehow I went to law school. I went to law school because throughout all the work that I did, I kept bumping up against legal issues and thinking, gosh, there really should be some answers to these questions. And we're not adverse to paying for attorneys, but I didn't feel like we were going to get the answers that we really needed, and probably couldn't pay for the full extent of what my agricultural community really needed to move forward. So I went to law school, founded Farm Commons, and here we are 8 years later. If you could do the next slide. Okay, our mission. We empower the agricultural community to understand and solve business law issues within an ecosystem of support. The big thing we do is education, just like this. We help explain legal issues in ways that people can understand and in ways that they can take action on. So workshops are a big thing for us. Workshops on farm law for farmers and ranchers, but also for agricultural support persons. So nonprofit staff, extension agents, lenders, insurance agents, even attorneys. We produce lots of print guides. Oh, we just loaded them into our brand new website, and there's at least 100. Podcasts, webinars, We launched a moderated private social media platform where our members ask us questions and we're able to give them feedback and respond to their questions. It's also open to all our members, so farmers can ask farmers other legal questions too. Extension agents, everybody can participate together in a discussion of farm law. We also run programming to provide technical support to farm educators and farm organizations. We write custom curriculum, research issues, all of that stuff. And we are a 501c3 charitable nonprofit. So presentations like this fit perfectly into our mission, because even though you're not necessarily all directly related to farming, you are part of the agricultural community, and legal issues are really important to the work that you do. Claire invited us to be a part of this presentation, and I was thrilled to be involved because issues of employment law, volunteers, interns, all that sort of thing are really bread and butter issues for us. They are things that farmers themselves face every day. Particularly in the farm context, employment law is extremely complex, and it has a lot of subtleties and nuances. So it is a pleasure to be able to get you some access to this information today. So we'll start with the basic question. What is a volunteer? It sounds so easy. It sounds like, well, surely there will be an answer, right? Okay, I'll throw one to you. Here's an answer. A volunteer is a person who gives their time for civic, charitable, or humanitarian reasons without promise, expectation, or receipt of compensation. Whew, sounds good? Straightforward? I'm hiding a lot of stuff. I gave you a nice, easy definition because it's all I've got for you. But if we take a peek under the hood of this easy explanation, we find a lot of complications. This little definition is housed in, go back. I got a little bit more to do here. Thank you, though. Thank you for anticipating. Housed in the Fair Labor Standards Act. Claire referred to this. This is a federal law passed, like 80 years ago, that established minimum wage and overtime for the first time in America. It applies in every state. It is the baseline. So it's an old definition, but its home in the Fair Labor Standards Act is nestled within a section that is specific to whether and how the Fair Labor Standards Act applies to government employees. I left a key phrase out of this definition so I could fit it in the slide and make it seem easy. It is a person who gives their time to a public agency for civic, charitable, or humanitarian reasons. That's kind of terrible, right? You probably, all y'all in the room and all the farmers I work with are not government entities. So, now all of a sudden this law doesn't actually apply to us. So that's a bummer. And there is not another source that explicitly defines what a volunteer is, particular for the purposes of employment law. Do employment laws apply to these people? How and what kind of work can we have them do, et cetera, et cetera. But that being said, it has still turned out to be quite influential. The law does this all the time. It's not thorough. It handles issues as they come up. It leaves holes all over the place, and we're all left to, try to figure out what's going on. So what we do is we look to what we do have. So this is what we have, and it's considered persuasive. So technical legal term for, sure, the court is going to look at a definition like this, even if it doesn't technically apply to an individual circumstance that the court is trying to pass an opinion on. So we're going to call this persuasive, even though you can't actually go to the bank with this definition. So more complicated than it looks, but still legit. It's still something you want to look at and say, oh, okay, I'm getting it. Let's forget that part about the public agency, and I took it out for your convenience. So that's what a volunteer is. It's only partly helpful. Let's look at what a volunteer is not, because that's also helpful. Okay, so there's our next slide. All right, I got a couple of things for you about what we know a volunteer is not. A volunteer is not a person who does the work of a for-profit business. Now, how do I know that? There's not an anti-definition in the Fair Labor Standards Act either. There's only definitions. So where did I come up with this? This is a synthesis of a bunch of case law that has evolved since the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed 80 years ago. People have come to this question for a variety of reasons over the years. And this is a definition that has, let me phrase that slightly differently. On the other hand, from a volunteer, we have an employee. The definition of employee has evolved concurrent with litigation around the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the definition of to employ someone. To employ someone means to permit a person to do the work of a for-profit business. Seems weird, right? To employ someone is to permit a person to do the work of a for-profit business. To employ someone does not mean to write a job description, post a position announcement, interview people, accept a candidate, and then give them dollars in exchange for their labor. That is not the definition of to employ someone. The moment you permit someone to do the work of a for-profit business, you have employed them. So that's the result of a lot of case law. And one of the central cases that came out in the 40s was in the train industry. I feel really bad calling it the train industry. There must be something more sophisticated, but I don't know. The era of trains is not so robust now. So what was happening is we have all of our train conductors and our train workers, and they're, tooling around the train yard doing train things, and they're training people at the same time. So there's these people called brakemen. I assume there were no brake women, but maybe brake people. So there's brake people, and their job is to pull the brake on the train. But people have to learn how to be brakemen, and part of how they did that is they just rode along and pulled the brake when they were supposed to. Well, they filed a lawsuit and said, look, the train companies are expecting us to volunteer for this. They're expecting us to just show up, learn how to pull the brakes, and do that without pay. I mean, that can't be fair, right? We're employees. We're pulling the brakes. Trains have to stop. So, we're doing vital work here. Shouldn't this be employment? And the Supreme Court of the United States said, yep, that's employment. Because the train company is letting these individuals do the work of the for-profit train company, they have employed them. It doesn't matter if that individual is willing to ride that train for free and get paid nothing to do it for the virtues of learning to be a brakeman. Because as you can imagine, these cases tended to evolve during the Great Depression when the jobs were scarce, and people were willing to work for free on the potential that they could become employed later on. So we have a power situation going on here. We have people who have the power to employ others and give them, wage earning labor, and people who are willing to do anything to try to get that employment. This corrects that power imbalance that the court perceived and said, look, hey, we're going to put a stop to that. Doing the work of a for-profit business is employment. And what that did is killed volunteer brakemen. So what we know now today is that a person who does the work of a for-profit business is not a volunteer. They're an employee, unless there's something else, which would namely be an independent contractor, but that's a subject for another day. Another thing that we know a volunteer is not is an individual who is doing the same tasks as a volunteer that they are otherwise paid to do as an employee. So imagine the scenario where you are sitting at your desk at work on a Friday afternoon, and the boss comes to you and says, I was thinking you could put in a few hours on Saturday tomorrow, and I was thinking you could volunteer. They can't pay you, but I really need you to be here tomorrow. Okay, you can see the obvious reason why the court wants to stop that. They want to say, hey, you can't expect your employee to do the same task as a volunteer that you would otherwise pay them to do. This leads to a sense of coercion and power imbalance again. So the law stepped in and said clearly through regulations that you can't expect an employee to volunteer for the same tasks that they would otherwise perform. So that is helpful, and that also applies to nonprofit organizations. So I've covered for you, what do we know that a volunteer is? What do we know that a volunteer is not? But let me make sure I'm making my point on the next slide. If we don't have a volunteer, we have an employee, and all employment laws apply. A person is either a volunteer or an employee or an independent contractor, but that's for another day. There really are not other options. So what does this mean for gleaning? Gleaning organizations have volunteers. My question for you is, do gleaning organizations actually have employees? And what does that mean when we have the intersection of a for-profit farm in the picture as well? These issues are complicated. They are much more complicated than most people realize. We rationally have a sense in the United States of America that we understand what volunteering is and what employment is, but that is not necessarily how the law sees it. The reason we can persist in our misunderstandings and persist in our confusion is because there's a distinction sometimes between a law and a law's enforcement. Employment laws are enforced when either of two things happens. Number one, the employed individual becomes disgruntled and files a lawsuit. Yes, it is entirely possible, and it does happen, that volunteers become disgruntled and file lawsuits saying, look, I'm actually an employee, and now I'd like to be paid all my back wages and my overtime and my workers' comp and my, all that stuff. It does happen. It's not common, though. This is not common. Most people volunteer because they, want to. They want to do that thing, and they know that they're not going to get paid for it, so they're totally cool with it. But the other way that these laws get enforced is where government becomes upset. So the government, state and federal government, can choose to enforce these laws, and they can choose to enforce them even when the volunteer, in finger quotes, is perfectly happy. The government can still say, we have a problem with that, and we are going to file a lawsuit. So there is one of the leading Supreme Court cases on the issue of volunteers. And the scenario there was where a nonprofit, they help people recover from drug and alcohol addictions, and in so doing, they gave them work skills. They had a residential program. And as part of the treatment, these folks worked in, I forget what it was. It was not a resale shop, but I think it was like a chain of convenience stores across the United States. Their folks going through rehabilitation worked in these convenience stores. The government was actually the one who brought the lawsuit and said, your clients, your persons engaging in rehabilitation are employees. Those volunteers got on the stand, gave evidence to the Supreme Court saying, oh my God, no, I'm not an employee. I don't want to be paid for this. And there was a religious aspect to this too. And they said, look, I am serving God. I am not here to get paid. And the Supreme Court said, don't really care. You're an employee, and employment laws apply. So this is not common, but it does happen. And gleaning organizations, farms, and all of us in all aspects of food production, food systems development, stand to take a close look at the situation, the legal situation when it comes to volunteers and employees, and make sure that we understand where on the risk continuum our situation falls. And only then can we make decisions about where we want to fall on the risk continuum and what's really right for our enterprise. So let's get into a little bit more detail about how this works. Okay, so next slide, please. Most of you, by and large, are going to be operating nonprofit entities. Most cleaning entities are nonprofits. Not all of them, but let's assume that is your situation. You're part of a nonprofit, and as a nonprofit, you recruit volunteers to do gleaning. You recruit individuals on an evening or a Saturday, and they go out to a farm to glean product. What we have okay, pause, let me finish my thought there. I get ahead of myself sometimes. Is that fine? Yes, that's probably fine. It's probably totally fine for you to have volunteers, collect them on a Saturday, go out and collect the tomatoes. Now, why is that fine? Let's look at our basic definition that we had earlier. A person who gives their time for civic, charitable, or humanitarian reasons. You're probably going to check that box just fine. Rescuing food from the landfill or keeping it from rotting and providing it to those who don't have the means to pay for it or who need healthier options is absolutely a great humanitarian reason. Did those individuals show up without promise, expectation, or receipt of compensation? Probably, yeah. We'll get to a little bit more on that later, but let's assume, yeah, you can check that box too. All right, they're probably a volunteer. So in your classic sense, when you go and you collect unharvestable or unmarketable fruit and vegetables and then bring it to a food shelf, we don't have a problem. It's probably volunteerism. But let's say things get a little bit more complicated. Let's say that what's happening is we are getting paid for the product. Let's say that, I'm sorry, and by we is the farmer. I mean, I'm the farm and I am getting paid for the tomatoes or the cabbage or whatever the case may be. This doesn't seem like it would fundamentally change the dynamic. But what this affects is my definition of an employee. An employee is an individual who does the work of a for-profit business. The work of a for-profit farm is to produce a crop, harvest it, and market it. Anything involved in producing, growing, harvesting, and selling that crop is the work of that operation. So let's say that I am a gleaning entity and I send out my crew to harvest some perfectly glorious tomatoes that are marketable, but I want the best quality tomatoes for my operation. And because they are best quality, I'm going to pay the farmer. This runs the clear risk of having those volunteers doing the work of the for-profit farm and thus being classified as employees under the law because they are engaging in the harvest of a crop that is marketed just as a normal business, a normal farm would market their tomatoes. So we might be saying, well, but come on, I mean, the volunteers came from the gleaning organization. It's not like the farmer hired them. The farmer might not even have asked or expected them to come. The gleaning organization probably came to the farm and said, look, I'd love to buy your tomatoes. I do need a discount because look, it's a food shelf here. But I'm going to get a volunteer crew together, and we're going to come out to your farm. None of that actually changes the definition of an employee, which is to do the work of a for-profit business. It actually doesn't matter to that definition how they got there, who recruited them, and the broader circumstances. What matters is they're doing the work of the for-profit business. So in the case that a volunteer becomes disgruntled and wants to file a lawsuit, or in the case that the government becomes upset about this scenario, the person who's committing a labor violation here is the farm. It is the farm who has employees on their hands that aren't being treated as employees with employment laws being followed. So what can end up happening is the nonprofit isn't the one liable for this, but they did set up the for-profit business to become liable for this. So key problem to keep in mind. It's not something that most nonprofits are aware of, and it's not something most farms are aware of either. This conversation isn't really happening where people are saying, you know, hey, are you making me liable for a, you know, employment law violation? And neither is the nonprofit saying, boy, I hope I'm not getting you in trouble here. And it's not our intent to cause those kinds of adverse, difficult conversations. We simply need people to be aware of this and to internalize what's going on here and be aware of and manage their risk. We will talk about how to manage your risk in a few slides yet to go. So that's my first bullet point on, even though you're a nonprofit, you may accidentally be setting the farm up for a labor law violation. Our second case where a nonprofit needs to be very careful is in the instance where volunteers are relying on that nonprofit for their livelihoods. So this pulls directly on the Supreme Court case I told you about, where we have our persons being rehabilitated who are dependent on that nonprofit for their food, for a living stipend, for the dorm type facilities that these individuals stayed in. In that context, where those individuals are performing work for the nonprofit, they are considered employees. So I doubt that that's a scenario that many gleaning organizations are getting into. Most gleaning doesn't involve residential type arrangements, but in the instance where you are headed in that direction, it's really good to know that once individuals become reliant on you for livelihoods, your relationship with them as volunteers can very much change, and they can become your employees. All right. So yeah, next slide. Thank you so much. All right. So I got some more FAQ style issues here where we're going to pull up some different scenarios. The scenario we just covered, we just spent a lot of time on our last slide, was the scenario where the gleaning organization is paying the farm. Now let's switch it up a bit. In this scenario, the volunteer is receiving some compensation. Let's say that maybe they receive cash, but a lot more likely they're actually getting food. You know, hey, we've got some cabbage to harvest, and you can go home with, you know, enough cabbage to make kraut for a year. This can be a good opportunity. I once gleaned enough potatoes from a field to like feed me and my friends for like 2 years, and my buddy still calls me up and asks me, "Can we go get those potatoes?" And I'm like, "They don't grow potatoes anymore." So this is very common, and it's a terrific opportunity. But it's complicated. It's complicated. If you recall my definition of a volunteer, the only thing we got and the thing that we cling to says a person who gives their time for charitable, civic, charitable, or humanitarian reasons without promise, expectation, or receipt of compensation. So we're all very likely to be hitting the first 2 points without promise or expectation. But it's that third one, receipt of compensation, that is problematic. In a scenario where we are going to harvest the flea-bitten cabbage and we take some home for ourselves, we are being compensated. Does that kill the whole deal? Not necessarily. We all know that in the real world, volunteers are frequently compensated. So what gives? What's going on? Well, 2 things. Number one, there's the law, and then there's the law's enforcement. And we covered how laws are enforced, disgruntled people or disgruntled government. It just doesn't happen that often that somebody gets disgruntled about somebody going home with cabbage. So we don't get a lot of lawsuits about it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't violate the law. It just means you assess the risk. But the other thing that we have is we have some IRS rulings. We have some IRS clarifications around this subject. Now, these do not relate exactly. This is the IRS, and the IRS is speaking to whether the cabbage is reportable income. Actually, yes. The IRS is concerned with whether we are reporting our cabbage as income. And they have said, look, volunteers who receive compensation is it's not reportable income to the extent that they are being reimbursed for their expenses. So, somebody, it took them a $3 bus ticket to get to the volunteer opportunity, and they get $3 of cabbage in return. Not reportable income. And now, to the extent that they got $8 of cabbage, we might have some reportable income going on. So when something becomes reportable income, it's like, oh, is that persuasive? Does that mean like maybe now we also have an employee and we have minimum wage concern and we have all these other things? Maybe it does. Maybe it does. We're skating into some unknown territory here. We do not get a lot of lawsuits related to these scenarios. So there's not a lot of opportunity for the court to express its opinion about how this would really play out. So the best practice is to not provide any compensation, or at least to keep it to the minimum of the actual expenses incurred to participate in the volunteer events. I've been talking a lot. So Stephanie, do we have any questions that we could take a look at?
Yes, indeed, we do. So Miranda asked a question. What about the situation in which the farm itself is a nonprofit? So her question is, if the
Yeah.
farm itself is a nonprofit, then can the gleaning org use volunteers to harvest crops that are paid for?
Right. Now, let me clarify. Even if the farm is a for-profit, the gleaning organization can use volunteers. Let me reiterate, there is no problem with the gleaning organization sending volunteers to harvest unmarketable crops from the field and to use those for hunger relief. No problem. Problems get introduced when the farmer is paid for that and or when the crop is actually marketable. That's when we start to have more problems. So let's get back to the question. What about if the farm itself is a nonprofit? That does make things even easier. We are avoiding falling into the definition of employment, which is to do the work of a for-profit entity. When we only have nonprofits involved, no one is doing the work of a for-profit entity. At that point, all we have to be worried about is the laws that affect how a nonprofit treats its volunteers. I raised one of those points for you today, which is if they become dependent on you for their livelihoods, then it is possible that you do have to treat your volunteers like employees. But that not being the case, the door is much more open to not worry about folks being actually being employees.
We're willing to take a few more questions, Rachel, in this
Mhm.
pause. We have a couple that are sort of related. Situations that I think could be summarized as the nonprofit themselves generating revenue from produce harvested by volunteers. So Lisa asks, in an effort to become more self-sustaining, we're considering utilizing gleaned produce to make value-added products for sale. That
Right.
revenue would go back to the program, but can you explain sort of the legal situations they might need to consider? And I believe Keith had a similar question. What if a grant reimburses you, the nonprofit, for produce donated? Could
Right.
you address those two scenarios, please?
Sure. So let's focus on the first instance to start. So let's say that our nonprofit starts a jam making business and they start gleaning raspberries, which quickly become unmarketable, and turn them into jam. Can the volunteers continue to glean those raspberries and or make the jam? So we look back at our definition of employee to do the work of a for-profit business. An individual who gleans jam for the production of jam, which is sold by the nonprofit, is probably not doing the work of a for-profit enterprise. Now, if the farmer is being paid for those raspberries, if they are not actually unmarketable, that's again where our problem occurs. This is hard to internalize, but this is primarily about whether the farm is experiencing an employment law violation. Because most of you are organized as nonprofits, and so you do have a lot of latitude. You have a lot of latitude when you're donating that product to a food bank or when you're using that to create a value-added product that you will sell. Nonprofits are allowed to generate products and to sell them, and even to make a profit off them. That's a decision you know, based on your 501c3 status and your accountant and where all your money comes from, but that's another presentation. So it's not an employment law issue. Now the grants. Now I'm assuming in this scenario that grant funding, that what this translates into is the farm receiving compensation for their product. This is again where our complexities get introduced. If they are receiving compensation or if the product is not actually unmarketable, then potentially yes. Potentially those volunteers are actually employees of that farm. Even if that money is grant driven. A for-profit business can always receive a grant. That's not a problem, but that doesn't change the nature of the labor being performed. It's not about whether they, you know, could or should pay for that labor, or, you know, it is about one thing. Are they doing the work of a for-profit business? And the work of a for-profit farm is to produce a crop and market a crop. So that's definitely a complicated situation, the one about the grants. And I don't think that there will be a clear answer, and we don't have enough, you know, case law and lawsuits and things like that to state anything further. We would just have to sit down and talk about risk. I've got a slide on that coming up.
Keith clarified just now that the grant actually goes to the gleaning group. So it's a grant. The nonprofit is generating revenue through a grant. That
Sure.
grant reimburses the nonprofit for pounds of produce donated.
Our central question is whether the work of a for-profit business is being performed, and I don't see how we're doing that. Okay, so kind of weird, folks. You know, you walk into this thinking they're going to tell me what a volunteer is, and all I'm doing is telling you what an employee is, but it's the more powerful definition that we have. It ends up being where we have to go, because this definition of a volunteer is so weak and irrelevant to, you know, everyone's situation. Okay, next scenario. Let's say a volunteer receives no, yeah, we just did this one. Next slide, actually. Awesome. Okay. If a volunteer pays to participate in a volunteer effort, does that impact their status as a volunteer? In a word, no. The definition of volunteer doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they paid to engage in that humanitarian effort without receipt of compensation. So, yeah, that's fine. Our definition of employee, someone who is doing the work of a for-profit business, that also applies regardless of whether the individual paid for the privilege. You know, if I'm harvesting perfectly marketable raspberries at a for-profit farm and I'm paying for the privilege, I still meet the definition of an employee. I'm just an employee who's paying rather than getting paid. So the sentence on my slide, whether they pay is not determinative. I hate when I use that phrase because it's sort of lawyerly. It just means it doesn't matter. It's not gonna, you know, determine anything. It's just another thing. Okay, so you paid to be a volunteer. You paid to be an employee. Okay, next slide. Oh, I covered this one thoroughly. If a farmer is compensated for the glean product, does that impact the ability to classify workers as volunteers? Absolutely, yes, it does. And it's not whether they're workers of it's not whether they're employees of the nonprofit, it's whether they're employees of the farm. All right, next one. All right, so what do we do? What do we do? Maybe you have a scenario where the farmer's getting paid or where the product is actually marketable. These are not bad things. These are wonderful things. You know, farmers deserve to be paid. And people who are taking advantage of gleaned produce deserve good quality produce. There's nothing wrong with this, but it is risk. And it's incumbent on each of us to assess risk. Risk is two things. Risk is the likelihood of a bad thing happening, plus the magnitude of the consequences if that bad thing does happen. What is the bad thing in this scenario? Well, if you're paying for produce, the bad thing is that the farm themselves, the farm is committing employment and is on the hook for all employment laws. And that's a bad thing for you in terms of the magnitude, because that's a PR situation, like you're going to feel really bad if that happens. You might not be financially on the hook, nobody might investigate you and, your employment or volunteer practices because you're a nonprofit. But it's pretty bad for community relationships and all that sort of stuff. So you can assess for yourself, how likely is it that one, volunteers will become disgruntled, or two, that the government will become disgruntled? And then two, how bad is it going to be if that actually happens? So things for you and probably your board of directors and whatnot, all your steering committees, to think about. And then think about, how do you want to manage those risks? You can manage the likelihood of bad things happening, of course, by minimizing scenarios where you are paying for the product and minimizing scenarios where you are taking actually marketable products. You may still choose to do it anyways. And then in that case, you can continue to decrease the likelihood by making sure that your volunteers are happy and content and interacting with the government to make sure that they are on board with what your program is. Now, I know that can be really dicey. Nobody exactly wants to call up the Department of Labor and saying, I'm doing this thing that I'm not sure is legal. Like, nobody wants to do that, because if they say no, they're totally on to you. So it's a thing you kind of got to you have to finesse. If you have if you have a lobbying staff, if you have an advocacy organization or a broader network that you participate in, those folks can help to interface on those conversations without you having to get directly involved. They can raise hypotheticals. They can, ask for policy interpretations or those sorts of things. And of course, magnitude of the consequences if bad things do happen. Um, you know, there are certainly ways to control your relationship with the public and public perception and all that kind of thing. So nobody's telling you to break the law. People are what I'm telling you is the reality of how these laws work and the decisions that are in your hands to be made about what to do about them. Next slide. More education is available. Farm Commons has some really good guides specific on these issues. We have a guide to interns and volunteers. It's called the Farmer's Guide to Intern and Volunteer Programs, but perfectly good for all of our food system players. We have some information with detailed state laws particular to interns and volunteers. Yeah, we also, now these are Farm Commons is a member-based organization as of March, and so access to our documents is limited to those who become members with us. So you can check out our Become a Member page and see about those details. Membership gives you a license to distribute these things to your farmers and other folks that you work with in our food community. So keep that in mind. And of course, at any time that cost is a barrier, you can reach out to see if we have a scholarship program for organizations like yourself. If you're really interested in this subject and you're like, gosh, there's so much legal stuff I didn't know, hey, we've got a workshop for you. There probably is a lot of legal stuff you don't know, and that's why we have a program called Guiding Resilience. It is for non-farmers. It is for food system advocates, nonprofit staff to get an overview in farm and food system legal issues. It's in 5 modules. We have a June session and a July session coming up. And we also run a community platform where you can ask us questions at any time, and we get back to you. And it's also open to the community. So my next slide is just that we're transitioning to question time. Try to leave a good 10 minutes, and then we have Claire's slide last as well with her contact information.
You both so much. I just tried to change the layout so that folks can see your faces and as well as the slides. So we do have a few more questions from the question tab. Viewers, you are welcome to add more questions to that tab as we go. And as Rachel and Claire have said, we can take questions. They can take questions back with them and follow up with you, or you can reach out to them in between sessions. All right, so it looks like we have a question from Amy about sort of this concept of tokens of appreciation. This was a question that I had as well before this session began. I think this is a common occurrence. How she's saying, in addition to allowing volunteers to take gleaned produce home, I tell them to take some to someone they know that may be in need. Does this mean we can't provide them with, say, pizza and soda afterwards? Where's that line of tokens of appreciation and compensation?
Great question. Great question. Now, recall that a lot of the statements that we have from government in this context are coming from the IRS and in the context of what is reportable income. So this is a distinction from what creates a minimum wage violation. Two different things, but we're drawing on what we have in a scant area of law. So what's the difference between tokens of appreciation and compensation? Now, the IRS definitely has a lot of materials on this, because if you think about it in your for-profit business context, imagine the boss of a large corporation going to his or her 500 staff and being like, I have a token of appreciation. Here's a fat $3,000 check for everybody. Or let's say I'm gonna convert half of your wages to a token of appreciation. Everybody's salary gets cut in half, and then what? Then there's no income tax. Then there's no payroll tax. So you can see that this hasn't evolved because people are getting too much cabbage. This has evolved because people in different contexts are trying to distort compensation and tokens of appreciation for much different purposes. But that doesn't mean it isn't still the rule, and it doesn't still apply in this situation. The law wasn't written for you, but it still affects you. So it's written for the lowest common denominator and all that sort of stuff. So what that means is there isn't really tokens of appreciation. There is compensation for, there is reimbursement for expenses incurred. So bus fare, and then there are things that facilitate the volunteering to occur. And that one's a lot harder to understand. But things like a meal are things that facilitate the act of volunteering. So if I'm going to volunteer for eight hours in a row, I kind of need a meal. And the fact of you feeding me facilitates my doing that. So pizza and a soda, that's fine. That's facilitating it. If you were to give me a bunch of frozen pizzas, that doesn't really facilitate it. It's more like a token of appreciation, which doesn't really exist in the IRS world. So I hope that adds a little context to it. One can delve into the world of IRS opinions on the subtleties and nuances here, but you're looking at it from a for-profit kind of context, and it gets a little crazy. Gym memberships and country club passes and all kinds of things.
Also a question about gas mileage. So I do think mileage reimbursement is a common thing in the volunteer world. Does that fall under the category of reimbursement of expenses, as you've referenced?
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that takes care of the questions in our question tab. If anyone has any, you're welcome to add them. We have a few minutes left in the session, but we'll let Rachel and Claire close things out for us.
I wanted to say thank you again, and again, please feel free to reach out if you have resources to share. If more questions come up that in the following days or weeks about this topic or the legal areas of gleaning more broadly, we'd love to hear those. And yeah, thanks again for having us.
Okay, thank you all. Just a friendly reminder to make use of the networking spaces that we have. You can reach out to our presenters or other folks who are viewers in this symposium. You have public rooms that have already been created, and then you can use your inbox at the top to search for different attendees' names, and you can either message or video chat them. So feel free to use any of those features that you see as appropriate in the break that we have before the next sessions, which start at 3:45. Thank you all.